Parshat Beshallach features the immediate aftermath of the Exodus and the Jewish people arriving at the banks of the Sea of Reeds of the Yam Suf, the sea splitting, the Jewish people singing praise and shira and song to Hashem, which was part of the morning prayers every single day of the year, the Oz Yashir, where the Jewish people acknowledged God's beneficence in protecting and saving the Jewish people. And then it has several other important chapters, including the falling of the manna from heaven. We're going to focus on the splitting of the sea itself, not even the song about it as we have in years past, but the splitting itself. And the title of this class is Parting the Waters to Reveal the Origin of Evil. Well, we're going to get to that toward the end of the class. What prompted thinking this week was a discussion I had with a daughter of mine who's a pediatric oncology nurse. And she explained to me that she had a patient who came into the hospital. And obviously, these are very, very tragic situations where a young child is diagnosed with cancer and is put into the hospital. And as happens not so infrequently with her, people notice that she's religious or for various reasons. And this family turned to my daughter and said, look, I spoke to our pastor, and the pastor said, don't blame God. This is the work of the devil. And the family expressed to my daughter how troubling the words of the pastor were, because that made them feel worse, that somehow their prayers to God and their connection to God were of no benefit to them. Because after all, this is the work of the devil. Where do they go with that? What are they supposed to do? And she explained that, a little bit why in Judaism, she doesn't get into theological discussions, but she suggested to them that perhaps they could think about it more. And there would be a way for them eventually to reconcile these tragic circumstances that they were dealing with at the moment and reconcile that with their belief in God and alter the advice, and that it would give them much more chance for optimism and certainly chance for opportunity for continued prayer. So that idea, that sense of fragmentation in the world, which belief in Satan automatically puts forward, made me think of the Exodus in an interesting way, because all idolatry and all paganism involves fragmentation. There are many gods. If I want fertility, I go to one god. If I want my crops to grow, I go to another god. Perhaps the ruler of the country is also a god or is the god or has rulership over us. I end up serving many masters, and there's no unified, no requirement to put the pieces together and to see the world in a unified way. And that's what I want to talk about today in terms of the splitting of the sea. But let's first look at some, I think, surprising, unusual thoughts about how the sea was split and the ramifications of the sea being split. And it's based partly on a talk by Rabbi Gladstein. But to get back to the statement that we made last week, we saw in Pirkei Avot the notion that the world was created in 10 statements by God. Now, that in itself raises a question of fragmentation in the minds of the rabbis. After all, and the Mishnah itself in Pirkei Avot, chapter 5, the first Mishnah in the parak says, why didn't God create it in one? Meaning, the question means there'd be a lot of advantage in there being one, because the harmony of the world, the unity of the world, it could be if God simply in one breath said, let there be all of creation, it would make it a little clearer that it's not layered one thing on top of the other. And we'll discuss at the end of this class the answer the Mishnah gives. But we're keeping that in mind. Let's look at the splitting of the sea itself. And if you want to follow along in the text, then we're going to do some textual reading, but we're not going to do deep textual analysis, which really supports the points in this class. But Parshat Beshallach begins on page 366 in the Stone Chumash. It's chapter 13 in Exodus, sentence 17. And we're going to pick up the narrative right there in sentence 21 and 22. It describes the Jewish people having gone out from Egypt, and it says right from the get-go, there was a pillar of cloud to lead the Jewish people, and by night, there was a pillar of fire so that they could travel day and night. And he, God, did not remove the cloud by day and the pillar of night from before the people. So it's just interesting to note the Jewish people were shot like a cannon, so to speak, out of Egypt. They traveled day and night. There's discussion as to why, but I think very profoundly, Rabbeinu Bechaya says that this notion of a few million people traveling day and night, at night, during the day having the cloud to shield them, at night having the fire to illuminate the way, shows a sense of intent on traveling from Egypt to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. Now, we know that's a journey that ultimately took 49 days, 7 weeks and 7 days, and that's why we celebrate Shavuot on the 50th day after the second day of Pesach. Well, don't deal with the complexities of that, but that's all in the text. But there was a certain sense that perhaps they could have made it in 3 days and been at Mount Sinai. And we know from the circuitous route that the Jewish people end up following, getting from Mitzrayim, getting from Egypt to Mount Sinai, to the land of Canaan, ends up taking 40 years. So to think that when they began, there was a march that could have taken 3 days, gives us a perspective here that there were a lot of wheels turning in terms of God's figuring the experiences, so to speak, that the Jewish people would need to have gone through to get from there, Mitzrayim, to here to the land of Canaan. And when you say experiences, that automatically means a lot of development, a lot of issues that they would have to confront about themselves and about others. It means there was growth that needed to happen. And let's keep that in mind throughout. Turn over the page 368, 369, chapter 14. And right away, we've got a lot of nuances going on. We see that the Jewish people, first of all, shockingly in sentence 2, it reads as follows. Hashem speaks to Moshe in chapter 14 and says, speak to the children of Israel and let them turn back and encamp before Pi Hachirot. So what's this idea of turning back? There's the Jewish people, like I say, traveling day and night. They had a destination, they had a goal, get to Har Sinai, get to Mount Sinai, receive the Torah with all of the fanfare, take that framework for living of the Torah, bring it with them into the land of Canaan, and fulfill the whole redemption of the Jewish people, which was to go from servitude to Egypt to the freedom of serving God in the homeland as promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We are to have them turning back and going in the wrong direction. Clearly, something is at work here. And really, there's multi-layers to this in the explanations of the rabbis. Number one, it meant that when Paro got his message that the Jewish people were confused in the wilderness, what does it mean they were confused? Because they were heading in one direction and they were turning back, and then they were pitted against the edge of the sea. Oh, so they don't know what they're doing. They're lost, and that would provoke in Pharaoh, here's my chance to again reclaim my dominion over God's people, to show that I am more powerful than God, to show that belief in God is naught, has no value, is useless, and I'll bring back whoever we don't kill. I'll bring them back to the land of Egypt triumphantly, and I'll reestablish myself as a god. There's no other way to put it, but that's what he was after. Okay, that's one sense. From the Jewish people's perspective, it also is a tremendous test or challenge. Because as we know, when the Jewish people found themselves right against the banks of the Yam Suf, of the Sea of Reeds, with the Egyptian army bearing down on them, some of them, this is the Ramban's understanding, Moshe, you brought us to a place of death. We could have all died in Egypt. There was a sense that Moshe's leadership was called into question. Perhaps God's providence was called into question. all these layers of meaning. So this idea of the Jewish people turning back and finding themselves at the edge of the Yam Suf, we have to understand that's not happenstance, not because they had a flat tire or because that was the way to go, but rather that was all part of Hashem's plan, which ultimately would delay the journey from the Exodus to Mount Sinai, but delay, as Rashi in the beginning of this portion points out, sometimes delay is good because things need more time. Sometimes, as he says, the straight route proves to be the longest route, and the circuitous route proves to be the most direct route. And that idea is not just in terms of how good your GPS is, but that idea really has tremendous meaning and importance for us as people to understand the extent to which God interacts with us, shapes our experiences, and really molds who we have the opportunity to become as human beings through the everyday living that we do. Very big ideas in Judaism. Now let's turn to a few details about the splitting of the sea itself. Surprisingly, and if you look at sentence 22, and here there's a lot of textual analysis, we're not going to go into all of it. In sentence 22 in chapter 14, which is on page 372, it says, Vayavohu b'nei Yisrael b'toch hayom b'yabasha, which means that the Jewish people, this is the sea split, and the Jewish people, the children of Israel, came within the sea on dry land, and the water was a wall for them on their right and on their left. Now, how do we envision this? Okay, so what experience do we have? For some of us, there's the movie The Ten Commandments for Charlton Heston, and they have a fanciful picture of the Jewish people poised on the edge of the water splitting, and then you see very specifically, and I could even show you a clip of this if you want to go on YouTube, you'll find it. The Jewish people sort of pour down what were the banks of the Yam Suf, down, 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 and then they're able to walk across on the dry land, a couple of million people with their animals and everything else, and emerge on the other side, and then see the waters collapse on the Egyptians. And for those of us who have gone to Universal Studios a few times, and I haven't done so recently, they actually have the physical setup that they used in the making of that film, where they created a channel, an invisible channel, in the midst of flat water. And then what you see is they push a button and the water basically disappears in between those two channels. And it looks, because they're glass or clear, it looks as though there's water standing here, there's water standing here, and there's a clear road. Again, it's indented down and up as a riverbed would be, as a seabed would be, for people to walk through them. Lo and behold, the nuances of the Torah say that's not what happened. And I think this is interesting, not critical to what we want to prove today, but the word vayavohu, that the Jewish people came into, as it says in 22, the children of Israel came within the sea on dry land. That and some other, whereas if you look elsewhere in the Torah and in the Navi, it's always vayerdu layam. People go down into the sea. Like people would say, you go down to the beach, you go down into the water. That's not there. So importantly, in terms of just the reality of what happened, and there's wind involved and blowing, we're going to get to more understanding of that. But what you should understand is this: the mechanics, according to Jewish tradition, and the Vilna Gaon takes time to express this, is that you had a sea with banks on either side. The Jewish people were pressed against it. And what happened is that the sea became split. That's the words, vayivaka hamayim. Not that Moshe split the sea. Those words don't appear in the Torah if you look at the Hebrew carefully. What you see is the sea was split. What do all this indicate? Interesting idea. Here's what really happened. At Moshe lifting up the staff at the command of God in the direction of Hashem, technically what happened is the river, the bed of the Yam Suf, of the Sea of Reeds, rose up and became flat with the land they were on. So if you just see the Jewish people were standing here, there's a body of water with a bank and a body and a shore on the other side. We'll stay with that image for a minute. So what happened was that the seabed lifted up like this until it became parallel, until it became one flat path going from the one short line to the other, and it became hardened. It's all described in the sentences specifically. It wasn't wet, it wasn't muddy. It became hardened for the benefit of the Jewish people. But normally when the seabed rises up, what would happen with the water? The waters would disperse to either side. And hence the second miracle was that as the seabed rose up, the water that it was being displaced piled into a choma, into a wall on either side. So what we should envision, and if we were making the picture of the Ten Commandments precise, we would see a seabed rising up to ground level. We would see the water that was in the seabed piling up into walls, and hence the notion that the sea became split, because this is the miracle was the seabed floor rising up, becoming dry, and the water piling up as walls, enabling the Jewish people to go through. And then what happens, it's nighttime, the cloud and the fire move to behind the Jewish people. They separate the camps, because as the Jews go through, the Egyptians follow. The Egyptians could have run them down and wiped them out. But lo and behold, this cloud that guided them and the fire that lit the way for them all moved to behind, separated the two camps. And by morning, the entirety of the Jewish people were on the other side, back on the flat, dry land that had been the bank of the water. At that point, the seabed that had risen up collapses, the walls collapse down, there's churning, and there's the complete destruction of the Egyptian people. And we can understand this destruction in the sense that they had already experienced the 10 plagues. They had already seen God's ultimate revelation of power. They persisted in feeling as though they could still prevail, and therefore, in front of the Jewish people not only had the original lesson of the 10 plagues and the going out of Egypt, but had the final dramatic lesson, which the Haggadah tells us was even more magnifying of the miraculous mastery of God, to see that the evil of Egypt was utterly destroyed. Not to be said about that in terms of details, but that should change our vision of it. The next thing we want to look at, and we're going to look at a map here. Interestingly enough, the normal perception is you leave Egypt, you've got to cross the Red Sea, and then you got to get to the other side so that then you can go to the land of Canaan. Now, there was no Suez Canal in those days, and the fact is it's not true. And I'm going to split the screen here and show you what we're talking about. This is a map that appears in the art scroll. Why is it not? Okay, we're going to share it first here. This is a map that appears in the back of the republished Stone Chumash, and it's a map of great detail. So let's just get oriented where we are. If you see on the top is the indentation of the Mediterranean, Hayam HaGadol, the large sea, using the arrow just to highlight it. And the Jewish people left from Ramses, so everything's in Hebrew here, but that's this red dot on the top. And the detail, of course, is that the fastest route they could have taken would have been to travel along the coast line of the Mediterranean, go right up into the land of Israel. But it says that God didn't choose to send the Jewish people that way because they would have encountered the Plishtim, the Philistines, and the Philistines would have defeated them. They wouldn't have had the strength to fight them. So again, in order to make the Exodus work in terms of the development of the Jewish people into the people that could receive the Torah at Mount Sinai and eventually enter the land of Canaan and conquer the land, was for the Jewish people to head, I'm not sure south is the right direction. It would be great to have a good sense of where north and south is on this map, but to head back rather down to Sukkot. And this is a detail which we can read in detail It's in the book of Bamidbar, chapter 33, sentences 5 through 11. But here's what's described. The Jewish people the Exodus happened from Ramses. They went to Sukkot, the name of a place there. They actually traveled between this body of water, which I forget the name of the lake, and the Yam Suf and the Red Sea. And they were already on the other side with clear sailing to head on. And this is Vayashuvu. Then God told Moshe, turn them back. Can you see the arrow I'm using to illustrate this? I hope you can. It's this arc, and then they reversed course, and then they found themselves at Pi Hachirot, which is a place that is named for a special idol of the Egyptians, that people would travel out into this wilderness to worship this idol. And the word Chirot indicates freedom, because there was a sense that there's no God, and therefore by worshiping this idol, we have freedom to be whatever we want. Now, here's the shocker. The shocker is that when the Jewish people enter the Yam Suf, they don't cross to the other side. They also make a circuitous route, and they end up back on the same side of the Yam Suf, and but above where they went in. And this is all detailed, black and white, at the end of the book of Bamidbar of Numbers. And then the Jewish people travel to a place called Morah, where they had no water. Then they go to Elim. They find themselves again on the other side of the Yam Suf. They go down to Midbar Sinai, and eventually they go to Mount Sinai, which is just below this map. Why is it important to understand this geography? It's important to understand it because, again, what's at work here is not a Lewis and Clark expedition setting out to go from the land of Mitzrayim to the land of Canaan that was promised to the Jewish people. What's taking place here is what continues to take place in your life and my life and the lives of all people, and especially the Jewish people collectively and individually, is a journey. And there's no better illustration than this. So the idea that when God says turn back, what do you mean turn back? Well, turn back because I want to test the Egyptians to see whether they've learned their lessons. I want the Jewish people to experience the near extinct experience of being caught by the banks of a body of water and surrounded by an enemy, because that's going to happen again and again in Jewish history. And the Jewish people are going to have to prevail. And what I mean by prevail here is they're going to have to learn to look for God's salvation rather than to throw in the towel and say it is a hopeless journey. And we know the Jewish people several times during the course of the 40 years in the wilderness, including this time, cry out to Moshe and say, you're ruining us. You're leading us on a fool's errand. And this is a test we have in life all the time. Are we on a fool's errand, or is God orchestrating experiences in a life and providing us with family, wealth, wisdom, opportunities to serve Hashem, opportunities to validate Hashem as the creator of the world? That's what it's really all about. And it's very exciting to think about this in these terms and to leave behind, a more simple notion of I need to get from point A to point B. And in order to do that, I've got to cross a sea. And in order to cross the sea, I won't be able to do that unless a miracle happens. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking here about Hashem bringing the entire process of the Exodus to fruition through a series of steps, through a series of actions and reactions taking place on the part of Pharaoh, on the part of his people, on the part bringing out to the surface, pun intended, the nature of the people of Mitzrayim. And the nature, and this is where we're getting to the theme of this class, to reveal an origin of evil, to understand it. And I just want to take a minute here to say, origin of evil has always perplexed the world, from the simple notion of, hey, why can't everybody just get along, to the idea that, well, it's all politics, or it's all power, or it's all this, or it's all that. We're going to see something as we look now in more depth into the unraveling of what took place at the Sea of Reeds, at the Yam Suf, a viewpoint that is important for us to understand. Many people consider it, as one person said in terms of the Holocaust, it's trivial to try to explain evil. Other people say it's incomprehensible. Other people say it's a satanic force, and we mentioned that in the beginning of the class. Let's follow these events very, very carefully. And to do that, we're going to look again at chapter 14, and it's going to highlight the steps that are involved in the splitting of the sea. So we're on page 372, 373 in the Stone Chumash, the Art Scroll Stone Chumash. And what we see is, in terms of the sequence, sentence 20. Well, let's start with 19. The angel of God who had been going in front of the camp of Israel moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved in front of them and went behind them. A little confusing. It came between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel, and there were cloud and darkness while it illuminated the night, and one did not draw near the other all of the night. Okay? So what we see taking place here is a detail here of a confused natural setting where there's dark and there's light and there is a normal order of events which are not following suit. And there is another detail I wanted to say here, which I didn't include, but that is that it begins let's continue with this. Sentence 22. What happens next? Well, let's look at 21. Moshe stretches out his hand. Hashem moved the sea with a strong east wind all the night, and he turned the sea to land, and the water became split. Next, the children of Israel came within the sea, as we described, on dry land, and the water was a wall for them. Next, sentence 23, the Egyptians pursued them. Let's skip over to sentence 27. Next page, 374, 375. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and toward morning the water went back to its power as the Egyptians were fleeing toward it. And Hashem churned the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. Sentence 28, the water came back, covered the chariots and the horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh who were coming behind the sea. There remained not one of them. A little nuance there, not one. But Rabbi Foreman, in a very interesting piece, evokes the sense similar to the concept we explained last week, but with a different message. That when you look back at the genesis of the world, and we turn back to chapter 1, and we begin the Torah again, what we see here is that things began, page 2 and 3, in the beginning of God creating the heaven and the earth was astonishingly empty, with darkness upon the surface of the deep, and the divine presence, which really says the Ruach Elokim, like a wind, was hovering over the water. God said, let there be light, and God separated light from dark. To continue on, what happens next? God split the waters. The world was covered with water. He created an upper water and a lower water. And as Rabbi Foreman says, in the mechanics of the splitting of the sea, God created a wall of water on the right and a wall of water on the left. So again, you're talking about things unfolding which are evocative of the underpinnings of creation. And just to continue it a little bit further, the next thing that happens is God says, let's gather the waters together so that there should be dry land. So again, what we see here by looking at the text and by comparing it to the text in chapter 14 is that what the Jewish people are now witnessing is they're witnessing what I say like the echo effect of the evilness of Mitzrayim playing itself out. But what they're seeing is, in a certain sense, the undoing of these first steps of creation, devastating the Egyptians being churned up and down in the water. What does that mean? It means, because there was tohu vavo, those are the words that Torah uses in sentence two. There was a sense of astonishingly empty, chaotic, a lack of order, all these elements being thrown together, but with no rhyme or reason to them. What I want to put forward here, and it's really Rabbi Foreman's concept just applied a little bit differently, I think, is that the orderliness of the world, and to go back to our Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, in Ethics of the Fathers, chapter 5, sentence 1, says the world was created in 10 statements. Why? Why didn't God create it in one? Meaning, why wouldn't the world be more unified? So the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot says, so that the righteous people should understand that they're literally upholding the world. Sentence in Proverbs, Tzadik Yesod Olam. What the Jewish people were witnessing here was a sense of evil, and here I want to add a thought, originating from a total denial of creation. And again, it was a common faith and belief in the ancient world. Today it could be even worse, but that the world always existed. So there's nothing to talk about with a creator. There's no origin story. I don't even need a Big Bang. I don't need anything. The world just always was. It has no beginning. It has no end. Why? It's very orderly. It seems very thoughtful. It just happened to be that way. And the truth is, if you want to tap in to the underpinnings of the physical world, think about Mother Nature. Think about a fertility god. Think about a god that can help me in war. Think about all these ancient beliefs fragmenting the world and breaking it down into 10 separate compartments. And along comes our Torah and says, no, you're right. The world presents itself as an array, but a righteous person who seeks a relationship with Hashem, a righteous person who's willing to delve into the process of creation, being 10 statements that were meant to create a perfectly harmonious whole, that a righteous person, through doing kindness, through prayer and serving Hashem, through studying Torah, which ultimately all became the exclusive role of the Jewish people, but originally wasn't meant to be for all people, you're not just doing a good thing, you're actually justifying this complex creation. And as the Mishnah says in Pirkei Avot, in Ethics of the Fathers, and evil undoes this, it unpins it, it brings it back to a primordial, chaotic sense. And this is not allegory. When you look at the lives of people who ultimately represent evil, all these books, the last days of this person, the last days of that tyrant, the fall of the Roman Empire, that's what you really see in all of these dramatic representations is a sense of reality becoming unconnected and chaos and diffusion taking place. So hence now we have a significant answer here. Why all these steps? Why did the Jewish people turn back? Why all these machinations of going the wrong way to begin with, passing by the Sea of Reeds, turning back so that you're stuck in this untenable, ridiculous position, and that you end up seeing hopelessness, and then being rescued. The sea splits, and lo and behold, where are you? You're back on the same side of the Sea of Reeds as you began, but you've experienced something, you've seen something, A truth has been revealed to you that forever we need to hold on to. That yes, the world is a complex place, and no one has a simple explanation why a child gets admitted to the hospital with cancer and why suffering takes place. And it's troubling and it's perplexing. But somehow faith and going back to belief in a creator, not just creating a world, but crafting experiences for each and every human being to live through, and for the Jewish people collectively to experience throughout history, is pushing the purpose of creation and, in a certain sense, making the ground solid for us to live upon it. Because after all, that part of creation, it harbored in the existence of plant life, trees, animals, and human beings. We don't live on the water. We live on the dry land. And God created that space for life. And he created that space between the heaven and the earth, and between the waters of the world and the dry land that we inhabit and that our food grows on, and the animals that we exist in the land with. God created all this to make manifest to us that, to the extent that we remind ourselves that the intricacies of the world were formed in 10 godly statements, and to the extent that we continue to tune in to God's statements and to God's presence in the world and to God's plan for the world, to that extent the world is robust, the land stays where it's supposed to be, the waters stay where they're supposed to be, and we live our lives of experiencing this reality in a way that forever deepens and connects us to Hashem. And the alternative is to live a chaotic life in a chaotic world that makes no sense. And why does anybody ever want to do that? Because there really is such a thing as escape from meaning. As much as people yearn for there to be meaning in their lives, there's a side of human nature which says, bring on the chaos. Don't explain anything to me. Just let me live. And that the name is Pi Hachirot, at the mouth of freedom, no containment, no boundaries. Just set me free. So in a certain sense, the lesson of the Yam Suf is, to the extent that we want to set ourselves free with no boundary and no orderliness and no meaning, the world is also going to be set free. And when the world becomes set free, all the underpinnings that enable us to flourish on earth also come to an end. And I think as we revise and update and deepen our understanding of the events of the splitting of the sea, how it happened, where it happened, why it happened, I think this becomes an extremely important chapter in the Torah. And it gives us, as we say at the Seder, it gives us 50 times the insight, not 50, I'm sorry, 25 times the insight in terms of the importance of living our lives with meaning, with purpose, and within the framework that God's Torah gives us to live. That's all. Think about it. We'll take it to heart. And if anyone has a question, I'm happy to try to answer it.
Thank you, Rabbi.